In 1895, the state of New York passed a law that regulated working conditions in bakeries. And so it was a state law that established certain kinds of regulations on the labor markets, the labor conditions in a typical industry, baking. And part of the law said that no individual baker could work more than 10 hours a day or 60 hours a week. So it's a law that set certain limits on the amount of work that an individual baker could be contracted to do. And so it's a law that regulates the kinds of contracts that individuals could make in this society. So here we have a paradigmatic example of the kind of conditions that are created in an industrial economy, where you have not farmers who own their own land, making their own life, working for themselves independently, but you have a set of social relationships that are grounded in economic purposes. So you have someone who owns a bakery and someone who is working as a baker. And in this case, there was a baker named Joseph Lochner. And about 10 years after the enactment of this law in New York, this owner of the bakery, Joseph Lochner, was convicted of violating its terms by employing bakers for more than the prescribed limit of the number of hours they could work. And so he was fined $25. He appealed his conviction. It was upheld. He appealed it again. Eventually, his case got to the Supreme Court. And in 1905, the Supreme Court heard this case, Lochner v. New York. And it's a landmark case in American constitutional history. And in fact, it's a case that gives its name to an era of American jurisprudence that has seemed to constitutional historians to somehow typify, to set the stage for almost a generation of constitutional jurisprudence. It's a decision that would be used as a precedent in other cases and that would set a tone for the kinds of decision-making that the Supreme Court would engage in over the next several decades. And it's an important case that the Supreme Court decides on the grounds of the Due Process Clause. Now, the Fifth Amendment, so one of the original Bill of Rights, defines the individual's right to due process. It says that no individual can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And so this is an ancient, one of these rights that comes out of the English constitutional tradition that is then expressly guaranteed by the Bill of Rights and is one of the most fundamental sources of individual rights in the American tradition. No individual can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. And so we see this essential defense, in this case, of liberty. Now, the Fifth Amendment, the Bill of Rights, originally is meant to apply to the federal government. And so the First Amendment, for instance, which protects the basic rights of speech and religion, is specifically worded so that it says Congress shall make no law. In its original instantiation, the Bill of Rights applies to the federal government. It was meant to apply to the federal government. The states at the time often operated in ways that would seem to us to violate the Bill of Rights, but this wasn't problematic at the time because the Bill of Rights was not meant to be applied to the states. However, the U.S. Civil War fought over the question of slavery that ultimately resulted in the Union victory and the preservation of the Union, saw the enactment of a series of amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. And these, and particularly important for us, the 14th Amendment, applied explicitly to the states. In fact, this was the point of them, was to create civil rights and equality in a way that would involve the states, the way that would apply to the states who were responsible not only for slavery, but also for other kinds of racial injustice. And so the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments, the fruits of the Civil War, apply the basic liberties that are guaranteed to American citizens to the state governments, and thereby restrict the actions of the state governments. And particularly relevant is the 14th Amendment, which says that no state, meaning the individual states, can deprive any individual of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. So the 14th Amendment is very closely related to the Fifth Amendment and applies specifically to the states and says no state can deprive an individual of liberty without due process of law. And so the 14th Amendment protects individuals in their liberty against their state governments. For us, the state of Oklahoma. And in 1905, this clause of the 14th Amendment was invoked by Joseph Lochner in his appeal to the Supreme Court. He said, "My right to liberty has been violated without due process because I have the liberty to contract." This regulation on the number of hours that a baker can work violates my liberty of contract. It restricts me as an individual. It violates my natural freedom, the kind of liberty that is reserved to me, that originates in the state of nature, that I naturally have, is violated, is restricted by this law. And the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, would side with him, would overturn his conviction, and would say that this state law, the state of New York, violated his liberty of contract. And the decision in which it did so was a landmark decision, and it is philosophically a very interesting one. The Supreme Court says that, yes, the states have certain kinds of police powers. The states have certain kinds of legitimate authority to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of the individual state. And in fact, in this sense, the state governments, so the governments of the various states, like Oklahoma, like New York, have a broader scope of action than the federal government, whose powers are specifically enumerated in the U.S. Constitution. The Supreme Court recognized that the state governments have much broader kinds of police power. But it says this law, which the state of New York defended on the grounds that it protected the health of the individuals and of the public, because if bakers worked too many hours, it was a danger to the public health, that it was a hazard to the general public. The Supreme Court argued that that was too flimsy and that it didn't rise to the level of justifying the violation of the liberty of contract. Think about what that means. The court is saying that the individual has a wide, not absolute, but a very wide, a very weighty, a very powerful right to form individual contracts as he or she wishes. And in fact, the court specifically says that this law violates the rights not only of the owner of the bakery, but of the bakers themselves. Because what if a baker wanted to work? What if a baker said, I want to work 65 hours. Yes, I've worked 60 hours, but I choose to work 5 more hours. I choose to work 10 more hours. I want to. Say I've got a family of 10 and I'm a father and my trade is baking. I want to work 70 hours a week. It's hard. I understand that, but it is my right to choose what to do with those extra 10 hours of my life. And whether or not you think the case is rightly decided in terms of constitutional law, and for the moment, whether or not you think this is right from an objective perspective of justice, try to take seriously this argument, the baker's potential argument, who could say, why should I not be free to choose what to do with those next 10 hours of my life? This is what the court decides. The court sides with that argument and says, this is a free action. The owners of the bakery don't come and make this baker work an additional 10 hours. They offer them a certain amount of wages, and the baker chooses whether or not to work another 10 hours. And if he doesn't want to, then he can presumably take himself elsewhere. That's the logic behind this, is that this is a voluntary transaction. And the court very specifically identifies it as a voluntary set of interactions, both from the perspective of the employer, but also from the perspective of the employee, saying that this is the employee's right to choose whether or not they want to make this contract. And so in a case like this, we see very clearly how the kind of contract-based society would come to look in the context of industrializing America. And we also see one place where this could find a footing in the American constitutional tradition, in a strong concept of liberty as including the right of an agent to make decisions as they wish. That kind of contractual freedom, protected in the Lochner decision.